When Allied forces entered Germany in 1945, they expected to find the wreckage of a defeated military. What they actually found, buried in archives, hidden in salt mines, locked in laboratories, and scattered across a continent, was something far more disturbing. Some of it had been deliberately concealed, some of it had never been intended for outside eyes at all, and some of it was so far outside what investigators expected that it took years, in some cases, decades, to fully understand what they were looking at. These are 10 secrets that Nazi Germany kept until the war forced them into the open. In the months after Germany's defeat, Allied investigators working through captured government buildings and military warehouses began to grasp the scale of something that had no real precedent in modern history: the organized, bureaucratically managed theft of an entire continent's cultural and material wealth. The Nazi looting apparatus was not a side effect of occupation. It was a deliberate, institutionally structured program with dedicated personnel, official mandates, and systematic record-keeping. The primary instrument was the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, a special task force established under Alfred Rosenberg with the specific purpose of seizing cultural property from occupied territories. It operated across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, the Soviet Union, and beyond, and it kept meticulous inventories of what it took. In France alone, the ERR cataloged and shipped to Germany approximately 22,000 art objects between 1940 and 1944. These were not items seized opportunistically by individual soldiers. They were professionally appraised, photographed, documented, and transported in organized convoys to storage facilities and the private collections of senior Nazi officials. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most powerful figures in the regime, made more than 20 personal visits to the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris, which the ERR had converted into a sorting facility, and personally selected hundreds of works for his private estate at Carenhall. Gold was taken from national reserves, libraries were stripped, religious objects were removed from synagogues and churches. Private collections belonging to Jewish families were confiscated under the legal cover of abandoned property laws that the regime had written specifically to legitimize the theft. The Rothschild family collection alone, one of the most significant private art holdings in Europe, was seized in its entirety. When Allied forces discovered the Altausee salt mine in Austria in May 1945, they found nearly 7,000 works of art stored in its tunnels, paintings by Vermeer, Michelangelo, Van Eyck, and Raphael among them. Hitler had intended the collection for his planned Führer Museum in Linz, a cultural institution meant to house the greatest art in Europe under German ownership. The recovery effort that followed, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, spent years tracking down and returning looted property. Decades later, that work was still continuing. Estimates of the total value, adjusted for current market prices, run into hundreds of billions of dollars. A significant portion has never been recovered at all. The looting program was one of the first major secrets to emerge after the war. What came next went considerably deeper, into the structure of the regime itself, and into what Germany's own people had actually known about what was happening around them. In the final weeks of the war, as American and Soviet forces raced toward each other across a collapsing Germany, teams of American military intelligence officers were racing for something else entirely: scientists. Germany in 1945 was home to some of the most advanced aerospace, rocketry, chemical, and weapons research in the world. The V-2 ballistic missile program, based at the Peenemünde Research Facility and later at an underground factory called the Mittelwerk, had produced the world's first operational long-range ballistic missile. The scientists behind it, led by Wernher von Braun, represented a generation of technical expertise that the United States recognized as strategically invaluable in what was already taking shape as a post-war competition with the Soviet Union. The program that brought these scientists to America was initially called Operation Overcast and later renamed Operation Paperclip. It was authorized at the highest levels of the American government and operated in deliberate tension with the official policies of the Nuremberg trials, which were simultaneously prosecuting Germans for war crimes. Paperclip's central mechanism was the falsification or suppression of the participating scientists' wartime records. Cases where Nazi Party membership, SS affiliation, or direct involvement in war crimes were documented were quietly set aside or reclassified to allow security clearances to be issued. Werner von Braun held the rank of SS Sturmbannführer. He had been present at the Mittelwerk facility, where V-2 missiles were manufactured using slave labor drawn from the Dora concentration camp. Prisoners worked in underground tunnels in conditions that killed thousands of them. Von Braun later claimed he had no authority over labor conditions and no knowledge of the full extent of the prisoners' treatment. His SS file was not made available to the reviewing authorities who approved his transfer to the United States. Von Braun went on to become the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon in 1969. He was celebrated as a national hero. His wartime record remained largely outside public discussion until investigative journalism and declassified documents began surfacing it decades later. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists were brought to the United States under paperclip. The Soviet Union ran a parallel program, Operation WWII, which relocated German scientists to the USSR, sometimes by force. Both programs ensured that the scientific knowledge developed in Nazi Germany, including knowledge developed through forced labor, was absorbed directly into the post-war military programs of the two emerging superpowers. The existence of paperclip was not publicly acknowledged by the American government for decades. When it did become known, it produced a reckoning that is still incomplete, a set of questions about what compromises were made, what was deliberately concealed, and what the long-term consequences of those decisions were for the survivors whose suffering had helped produce the science being transferred. For decades after the war, a dominant narrative held that ordinary Germans had not known about the systematic killing of Jewish people and others during the Holocaust, that the extermination program had been conducted in secret, known only to those directly involved, hidden from the broader German population. The documents uncovered after the war and the research conducted by historians over the subsequent decades told a considerably more complicated story. The deportations were public. Across Germany and occupied Europe, Jewish neighbors, colleagues, and community members were removed from their homes, assembled in public spaces, and transported in trains that passed through populated areas. These were not covert operations. They were conducted in daylight, in city centers, in front of thousands of witnesses. Letters sent home by German soldiers serving on the Eastern Front described mass killings with a directness that indicated the writers did not believe they were sharing secret information. Historians who studied the correspondence of ordinary German soldiers found accounts of executions, of mass graves, of the killing of entire Jewish communities, written matter-of-factly, sometimes with disturbing casualness, to family members at home. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed German forces into the Soviet Union and shot more than 1.5 million people in open-air executions between 1941 and 1943, operated with thousands of participants and in front of local populations. There was no secrecy about what they were doing. The concentration camp system was embedded in German society in ways that made genuine ignorance difficult to sustain. Dachau, the first concentration camp, had been established in 1933, the same year Hitler came to power, and its existence had been publicly announced in the German press. The camp's near population centers employed civilian contractors for construction and maintenance. The ash and smoke from crematoria at facilities near towns were visible and documented in post-war testimony from local residents. Robert Giladely, a historian who spent years studying Gestapo records and German public opinion during the Nazi period, documented how much information about the regime's persecution was available to ordinary Germans through official announcements, newspaper coverage, and direct personal witness. His conclusion, that the regime operated not primarily through terror directed at the broader German population, but through a combination of broad popular support and widespread passive knowledge of what was happening, ran counter to the post-war narrative of collective ignorance and generated significant debate. The question of what ordinary Germans knew, and what they chose to know, remains one of the most debated in modern historiography. What the post-war documents establish beyond serious dispute is that the picture of a tightly held secret, known only to a small group of perpetrators, did not match the historical record. In the summer of 1945, as American scientists at the Trinity test site in New Mexico detonated the first nuclear device in history, a group of Germany's most distinguished physicists was being held at Farm Hall, a country house in England. Their conversations were secretly recorded by British intelligence. What those recordings captured, declassified and published in 1992, was one of the more remarkable documents of the entire war. Germany had run a nuclear weapons program during the war. It was called the Uranverein, the Uranium Club, and it included some of the most accomplished theoretical physicists in the world, including Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics. The program had access to heavy water produced in Norway, uranium ore from occupied Czechoslovakia, and the intellectual resources of a scientific establishment that, before the Nazi period, had been among the most advanced in the world. The program failed to produce a weapon. The reasons for that failure have been debated ever since, whether it was a shortage of materials, miscalculations in the physics, deliberate sabotage by some of the scientists involved, or simply the disruption caused by Allied bombing and the pressures of a country fighting a losing war on multiple fronts. When the German scientists at Farm Hall heard the news of Hiroshima on the BBC on August 6, 1945, their recorded reactions were a mixture of shock and disbelief. Heisenberg initially doubted that the Americans had built a fission bomb. Within 24 hours after receiving more information, he had worked out the approximate physics of how it had been done. The Farm Hall transcripts raised a question that has never been fully resolved. Did the German program fail because it couldn't succeed, or because the scientists chose not to push it to completion? Some historians have argued that Heisenberg and others deliberately steered the program away from a weapons focus. Others have concluded that the failure was simply technical and logistical. What the post-war investigation established with certainty was that the German program was further from a working weapon than Allied intelligence had feared during the war. The American Manhattan Project, which had operated on the assumption that Germany might be months away from a nuclear device, had been chasing a threat that was less immediate than estimated. That knowledge came too late to change any wartime decisions, but it reshaped the historical understanding of just how much of the nuclear arms race had been driven by fear of what Germany might be building. Among the documents captured from SS headquarters after the war were the records of a program that had been operating since 1935, with very little public discussion even inside Germany. The Lebensborn program, the name translates roughly as Fount of Life, was an SS initiative personally overseen by Heinrich Himmler, and its purpose was the deliberate expansion of what the regime defined as the racially desirable German population. The program operated on two levels. The first was a network of maternity homes, facilities where women who met the regime's racial criteria could give birth with full medical support, and with the SS taking responsibility for the welfare of the child. Women who used the homes were not required to be married. The program explicitly encouraged unmarried women to bear children with SS men, removing the social stigma that would have otherwise applied, because the regime's priority was population increase among the group it considered racially valuable. The second and far more disturbing level of Lebensborn's operations involved the abduction of children from occupied territories. In Poland, the Soviet Union, Norway, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere, SS units and civilian administrators identified children who met the regime's physical criteria, typically fair-haired, light-eyed children judged to have Germanic features, and removed them from their families. These children were placed in Lebensborn homes, given German names, taught German language and culture, and placed with German families as adoptees. The process was designed to be irreversible. The children's original identities were destroyed, their original names erased, and their families given no information about where they had been taken. Estimates of the number of children abducted through this system vary, but the figures most commonly cited by researchers who have studied the Lebensborn records range from approximately 50,000 to 200,000 children taken primarily from Poland alone. Across occupied Europe, the total may have been higher. After the war, the task of identifying and returning these children fell to the International Tracing Service. The work was extraordinarily difficult. Children who had been very young at the time of their removal had no memory of their original families or languages. Some had been told that their biological parents were dead. Some had formed genuine bonds with their German adoptive families and did not want to leave. In many cases, the records that would have identified them had been deliberately destroyed. Some of these children were never identified. They grew up as German citizens, never knowing what had happened to them, while their biological families in Poland or Norway spent the rest of their lives not knowing whether their children were alive. The last survivors of that generation have given testimony in recent decades through organizations documenting the Lebensborn story. Some discovered the truth about their origins only in old age, through DNA testing and archival research. By the spring of 1945, it was clear to the senior figures of the Nazi regime that defeat was inevitable, and the question for many of them shifted from how to win the war to how to survive its aftermath. What emerged in the months and years following Germany's surrender was a network of escape routes, known as rat lines, that carried a significant number of war criminals out of Europe and into new lives in South America, the Middle East, and elsewhere. The rat lines operated through a combination of forged documents, complicit officials, and institutional assistance from sources that included elements of the Catholic Church, particularly in Italy. The Vatican's role remains a subject of historical debate and ongoing archival research, but what is documented is that a number of senior Nazi figures passed through Rome using identity documents issued by the International Committee of the Red Cross under false names, a process that required at minimum the cooperation of individuals within organizations that had legitimate authority to issue such documents. Adolf Eichmann, who had administered the logistical organization of the deportation of European Jews to the extermination camps, a role that put him at the operational center of the Holocaust, escaped to Argentina using the alias Ricardo Clement. He lived in Buenos Aires, working in a Mercedes-Benz factory for nearly a decade before Israeli intelligence operatives identified him. In May 1960, Mossad agents abducted him from a Buenos Aires street and transported him to Israel, where he was tried, convicted, and executed in 1962. Joseph Mengele, the SS physician who had conducted selection on the arrival ramp at Auschwitz and carried out medical experiments on prisoners, particularly children and twins, also escaped to South America. He lived in Argentina, then Paraguay, then Brazil, under various identities for the rest of his life. West German authorities issued warrants for his arrest. Multiple governments, including the United States and West Germany, conducted searches for him at various points. He died in Brazil in 1979, of natural causes while swimming, without ever being brought to trial. His remains were identified through DNA testing in 1985. The existence of the rat lines and the degree of institutional assistance that some escapees received was not fully documented until decades after the war. The Simon Wiesenthal Center and the work of independent historians pieced together the network over many years. What emerged was a picture of a post-war failure, a moment when the international commitment to justice for Nazi crimes was subordinated to Cold War politics, organizational complicity, and the practical difficulty of pursuing men who had disappeared into countries with limited extradition agreements and, in some cases, sympathetic host governments. Among the more unusual programs to emerge from the captured SS records was the Ahnenerbe, a research institute established by Heinrich Himmler in 1935, whose stated purpose was the investigation of the history and culture of the so-called Aryan race. What the Ahnenerbe actually pursued over its decade of operation was a combination of legitimate archaeological work, ideologically driven pseudo-scholarship, and investigations into the occult and esoteric traditions that Himmler personally believed held the key to German racial destiny. Himmler was convinced that the history of the Germanic people stretched back to a mythological ancient civilization whose achievements had been obscured by conventional history. He funded expeditions to Tibet in 1938 and 1939, led by zoologist Ernst Schaefer, to search for evidence of Aryan origins in Central Asia. The expedition collected biological measurements of the Tibetan population, studied local customs, and gathered scientific data, all filtered through the ideological framework that Himmler had mandated. The Ahnenerbe sent researchers to Scandinavia to document runic inscriptions, to the Middle East to investigate ancient sites, and to various parts of Europe to excavate locations that Himmler believed held significance for Germanic prehistory. It also conducted research into astrology, the occult, divination practices, and the properties of herbs and natural remedies, all framed within the SS's ideological worldview. What the Ahnenerbe also did in its later years was become involved in human experimentation. Ahnenerbe researchers collaborated with SS doctors conducting experiments in the concentration camps. August Hirt, an Ahnenerbe-affiliated anatomist at the University of Strasbourg, developed a collection of human skeletons intended to illustrate racial theory. The skeletons were obtained from prisoners at Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp, who were killed specifically for that purpose. 86 people were killed to supply Hirt's collection. When Allied forces approached Strasbourg in 1944, Hirt ordered the bodies to be destroyed. The destruction was incomplete, and the remains were found by French forces. The Ahnenerbe's files, captured after the war, gave investigators an unusually direct window into the ideological apparatus that had driven the regime's racial obsessions. The combination of genuine archaeological fieldwork, elaborate pseudo-history, and the institutional connection to mass atrocity in the camps made the organization one of the stranger documents of how ideology and scholarship had been fused and corrupted within the SS. Germany's conventional military technology was well known to Allied planners by the end of the war, but the post-war investigation of captured facilities revealed a range of weapons programs that were further advanced than intelligence estimates had suggested, and a few that were unlike anything the Allies had anticipated. The V weapons program, the V-1 flying bomb, and the V-2 ballistic missile was already known and had caused significant damage to British civilian targets. What emerged from the post-war investigation was the extent of what had been planned beyond those weapons. The America Bomber Project, a Luftwaffe program that had explored designs for a long-range aircraft capable of striking the continental United States, produced a series of designs including the Hortenho 229, a flying-wing aircraft that used a shape remarkably similar to the modern stealth bomber, and which aeronautical engineers who studied the captured prototype found disturbingly advanced for its period. The Hortenho 229 had been developed by brothers Reimar and Walter Horten and had flown in prototype form in 1944. It was built around a jet-powered all-wing configuration that produced a very low radar cross-section. When Northrop Grumman engineers conducted a radar analysis of the Horten design in 2008 using a full-scale reproduction, they found that the aircraft would have been difficult to detect using the early radar systems Britain had deployed during the war. The German submarine program had produced the Type 21 U-boat, a submarine with a hull form and battery capacity that gave it far greater underwater speed and endurance than any submarine then in service. The design influenced submarine development in both the United States and the Soviet Union for years afterward. Germany's weapons programs had been advancing across multiple fronts simultaneously, fueled by the regime's willingness to invest enormous resources in technical development, even as the war was being lost. The post-war investigators who cataloged these programs spent months working through facilities that contained technologies they had not known existed. As the war drew toward its end, Nazi Germany moved with considerable efficiency to protect what financial resources it could. The network through which German assets were transferred, hidden and dispersed across neutral countries and overseas accounts represented one of the more sophisticated financial operations of the entire war, and one of the hardest to unravel afterward. Switzerland was the primary conduit. Swiss banks accepted gold deposits from the German Reichsbank throughout the war, including gold that Allied investigators later documented had been taken from occupied national treasuries and from the personal property of Holocaust victims. The Swiss National Bank purchased substantial quantities of German gold between 1939 and 1945, providing Germany with foreign currency used to purchase war materials from neutral countries. The post-war investigation of German financial assets identified and recovered a portion of what had been transferred. In 1997, the Swiss government commissioned an independent historical investigation, the WWII Commission, which produced a multi-volume report documenting Swiss financial dealings with Nazi Germany, including the acceptance of looted gold and the management of assets belonging to Holocaust victims whose heirs had been unable to claim them. In Argentina and other South American countries, German assets had been transferred through commercial channels in the war's final years, providing financial foundations for the communities that received escaping Nazi officials. The connection between the financial networks and the rat lines was documented by investigators working decades after the events themselves. German industrial corporations were found to have used forced labor extensively during the war. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate, had operated a synthetic rubber plant adjacent to Auschwitz, specifically to use concentration camp prisoners as workers. The plant, called Monowitz, held tens of thousands of prisoners under conditions that killed thousands of them. The post-war Nuremberg trials included a specific proceeding against IG Farben executives, and the company was subsequently broken up into successor corporations. Compensation funds negotiated in the 1990s and 2000s between German industry, the German government, and survivor organizations provided some measure of restitution to surviving forced laborers and their heirs. A direct consequence of the financial records uncovered in 1945, the final, and in many ways most consequential secret of Nazi Germany was not something the Nazis had hidden. It was something the Allies chose to keep contained for decades after the war ended. The Bad Arolsen archives, known officially as the International Tracing Service, were established after the war to document the victims of the Nazi persecution system. The collection, stored in a small German town in Hesse, accumulated over 50 million documents, concentration camp records, transport lists, death certificates, forced labor documentation, and the records of the displaced person system that processed survivors after liberation. It became the most comprehensive single archive of Nazi persecution documentation in the world. For more than 60 years after the war, access to those documents was severely restricted. Only recognized organizations searching for specific individuals, primarily for the purpose of tracing missing persons or establishing death certificates, were permitted access. Researchers, historians, and journalists were denied entry. The justification originally was privacy protection for survivors. As the decades passed and the survivors aged, that justification became increasingly difficult to defend, and survivor organizations themselves began demanding that the archive be opened. Full access was finally granted in 2007, after an international agreement among the 11 countries that govern the archive. When researchers and historians entered the collection in full for the first time, what they found expanded the documented picture of the Nazi persecution system in significant ways. The records showed that the number of camps, sub-camps, ghettos, and forced labor facilities in the Nazi system was far larger than previously documented. A 2013 study by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, drawing on the Bad Arolsen records along with other sources, identified more than 42,000 individual sites across German-controlled Europe. That figure, 42,000 distinct sites of persecution, was larger by an order of magnitude than what had been publicly understood even by historians who had spent careers studying the period. It meant that the infrastructure of the Holocaust had been embedded in the European landscape to a degree that made the post-war claims of ignorance by local populations even harder to sustain. The system had not been confined to a handful of major camps in remote locations. It had been woven through cities, towns, and industrial facilities across the continent. The full opening of the Bad Arolsen records also allowed researchers to document the fates of hundreds of thousands of individuals whose cases had never been formally resolved. People whose families had spent decades not knowing what had happened to them, receiving at last, more than 60 years after the fact, the documentation of what the archive had held all along. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.